The midwife's hands trembled as she pulled the newborn from his mother's womb, immediately recognizing that this child defied every law of human genetics. In the flickering candlelight of a remote Austrian farmhouse on March 15, 1847, Maria Kellner gave birth to a baby whose very existence would force medical science to confront the darkest extremes of human breeding. This case would expose a breeding experiment so systematic and disturbing that it challenged our understanding of human survival itself. The cottage reeked of stale bread, unwashed wool, and something else, the metallic tang of blood that had soaked into the wooden floorboards over generations. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann had traveled 60 miles through alpine snow to assist with what the local priest described as an unusual delivery. Nothing in his 15 years of medical practice had prepared him for what awaited. Inside, Maria Kellner, barely conscious from blood loss, clutched a rosary with fingers that bore 6 joints instead of 5. Her husband Joseph paced the narrow room, his gait unsteady due to legs of unequal length, a deformity that ran in his bloodline. The baby's cries echoed strangely, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from damaged vocal cords. "Document everything," Dr. Zimmermann whispered to his assistant as he examined the newborn. The child's skull showed the unmistakable signs of severe cranial deformation. His eyes, milky white with cataracts, sat too close together in a face that seemed compressed by invisible forces. Most disturbing were his hands, 12 fingers total, with thumbs that bent backward at impossible angles. The child would never walk, never speak, never live beyond his 3rd birthday. But the medical abnormalities weren't what made Dr. Zimmermann's blood run cold. It was the family Bible he discovered, its margins filled with meticulous genealogical notes spanning 4 generations. The same surnames appeared repeatedly, connected by marriage lines that formed loops rather than branches. Josef Kellner hadn't just married his cousin, he had married his mother. Every neighbor in the valley knew the truth, yet none had intervened. The local priest had performed the ceremony. The village elder had blessed their union. An entire community had enabled this genetic catastrophe, justifying it with whispered stories about keeping the bloodline pure and following God's plan. Dr. Zimmermann later wrote in his private journal, March 16, 1847, "I have witnessed the mathematical limit of human inbreeding. The child possesses genetic markers indicating over 90% shared DNA with both parents. This should be impossible among living humans." The Habsburg dynasty had practiced strategic inbreeding for centuries, but even their most extreme cases paled compared to the Kellner family tree. Charles II of Spain, known as the most inbred monarch in history, shared only 25% of his genes with his parents. This Austrian farm boy had tripled that concentration. What drove an entire bloodline to pursue such genetic extremes? How had they managed to survive 4 generations of systematic inbreeding when most such experiments ended in infant mortality or sterility? And most chilling of all, how many other families across Europe were conducting similar experiments in genetic concentration? The answers would lead Dr. Zimmermann into a network of isolated communities, each following the same twisted logic about bloodline purity, secret correspondence between noble houses, religious texts that justified incest as divine mandate, government officials who protected these communities from outside interference. But first, he had to document the medical impossibility lying in that Austrian cottage, a child whose genetic code read like a mathematical equation, pushed beyond all reasonable limits. What would you do if you discovered your own community was enabling such horrors? The baby died after 72 hours, but the investigation into his impossible existence was just beginning. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this case is already shocking you, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're about to uncover a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of European society. Dr. Zimmermann's lantern cast dancing shadows across the parish records as he uncovered marriage certificates that read like a genetic horror story. The musty basement of St. Plan. Magdalena Church smelled of rotting parchment and mouse droppings, each document revealing another impossible union that should have been forbidden by both law and nature. What he discovered in those church records would force him to question everything he believed about human survival and community complicity. Father Benedict Hauser, the elderly priest who had overseen the Kellner family's spiritual needs for 30 years, initially refused to discuss the marriages he had performed. His weathered hand shook as he poured communion wine at 9:30 that morning, spilling drops onto the altar cloth. "Some unions are blessed by God," he muttered when pressed about Joseph's marriage to his own mother. Who are we to question divine will? The church records painted a disturbing picture spanning back to 1793. Johann Kellner had married his sister Anna. Their son Klaus married his first cousin Maria, who was also his half-sister through their father's previous relationship. Klaus and Maria's son Joseph had then married his own mother after his father's death, producing the genetically impossible child Dr. Zimmermann had just witnessed. Each generation had grown more physically deformed, yet somehow more fertile. The family's isolation in the remote Salzburg Valley had allowed this genetic experiment to continue unchecked, protected by mountain terrain and community silence. April Twand, 1847. Examined burial records. Infant mortality rate in Kellner family, 87%. Yet surviving children show increased fertility despite severe deformities. This contradicts all known principles of genetics. Dr. Zimmermann's journal entries grew increasingly frantic as he documented the impossible. The mathematical probability of the Kellner bloodline surviving 4 generations of extreme inbreeding approached 0. Standard genetic science suggested they should have died out after the first generation of sibling marriage. Yet here they were, producing children who lived long enough to reproduce children whose genetic concentration exceeded anything recorded in medical literature. Village records revealed systematic enabling that bordered on conspiracy. The local magistrate had approved every marriage license. The midwife had delivered dozens of deformed babies without reporting concerns to authorities. Even the tax collector had listed the family as blessed with many children in official documents sent to Vienna. Nobody questioned the screams. Dr. Zimmermann interviewed Greta Hoffmann, the village midwife who had assisted with Kellner births for 20 years. Her cottage reeked of herbs and carbolic acid, its walls lined with jars containing preserved specimens she refused to explain. "The family pays well," she said, avoiding eye contact. "Some babies live, some don't. That's God's decision, not mine." When pressed about the severity of deformity she had witnessed, Greta's composure cracked. She described children born with organs outside their bodies, babies whose brains developed partially outside their skulls, infants whose limbs grew in impossible configurations. Yet, she had never once contacted authorities or refused to assist with deliveries. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond ignorance or religious justification. Financial incentives motivated the community's cooperation. The Kellner family owned the valley's only mill, controlling grain processing for 12 surrounding villages. Their economic power bought complicity from officials who might otherwise have intervened. But the most disturbing discovery lay hidden in the church's secret archives correspondence between Father Hauser and religious authorities in Rome, describing the Kellner family as subjects in God's great experiment and requesting guidance on the spiritual implications of concentrated bloodlines. The Vatican had been monitoring this genetic catastrophe for decades, treating it not as an abomination to be stopped, but as a test case to be studied. Letters dated back to 1821 revealed that church officials viewed extreme inbreeding as a method for creating purified souls closer to divine perfection. How many other communities across Catholic Europe were conducting similar experiments under religious protection? What network of correspondence connected isolated valleys where genetic concentration was being pushed to its absolute limits? The answers would lead Dr. Zimmermann far beyond Austria, into a world of calculated breeding programs that spanned multiple countries and involved the highest levels of government. But first, he needed to understand how the Kellner family had managed to survive when genetic science suggested they should have been extinct generations ago. Dr. Zimmermann's lantern cast dancing shadows across the parish records as he uncovered marriage certificates that read like a genetic horror story. The musty basement of St. Tass, Magdalena Church smelled of rotting parchment and mouse droppings, each document revealing another impossible union that should have been forbidden by both law and nature. What he discovered in those church records would force him to question everything he believed about human survival and community complicity. Father Benedict Hauser, the elderly priest who had overseen the Kellner family's spiritual needs for 30 years, initially refused to discuss the marriages he had performed. His weathered hands shook as he poured communion wine at 9:30 that morning, spilling drops onto the altar cloth. "Some unions are blessed by God," he muttered, when pressed about Yosef's marriage to his own mother. Who are we to question divine will? The church records painted a disturbing picture spanning back to 1793. Johann Kellner had married his sister Anna. Their son Klaus married his first cousin Maria, who was also his half-sister through their father's previous relationship. Klaus and Maria's son Josef had then married his own mother after his father's death, producing the genetically impossible child Dr. Zimmermann had just witnessed. Each generation had grown more physically deformed, yet somehow more fertile. The family's isolation in the remote Salzburg Valley had allowed this genetic experiment to continue unchecked, protected by mountain terrain and community silence. April 20, 1847. Examined burial records. Infant mortality rate in Kellner family, 87%. Yet surviving children show increased fertility despite severe deformities. This contradicts all known principles of genetics. Dr. Zimmermann's journal entries grew increasingly frantic as he documented the impossible. The mathematical probability of the Kellner bloodline surviving 4 generations of extreme inbreeding approached 0. Standard genetic science suggested they should have died out after the first generation of sibling marriage. Yet here they were, producing children who lived long enough to reproduce children whose genetic concentration exceeded anything recorded in medical literature. Village records revealed systematic enabling that bordered on conspiracy. The local magistrate had approved every marriage license. The midwife had delivered dozens of deformed babies without reporting concerns to authorities. Even the tax collector had listed the family as blessed with many children in official documents sent to Vienna. Nobody questioned the screams. Dr. Zimmermann interviewed Greta Hoffmann, the village midwife who had assisted with Kellner births for 20 years. Her cottage reeked of herbs and carbolic acid, its walls lined with jars containing preserved specimens. She refused to explain. "The family pays well," she said, avoiding eye contact. "Some babies live, some don't. That's God's decision, not mine." When pressed about the severity of deformities she had witnessed, Greta's composure cracked. She described children born with organs outside their bodies, babies whose brains developed partially outside their skulls, infants whose limbs grew in impossible configurations. Yet she had never once contacted authorities or refused to assist with deliveries. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond ignorance or religious justification. Financial incentives motivated the community's cooperation. The Kellner family owned the valley's only mill, controlling grain processing for 12 surrounding villages. Their economic power bought complicity from officials who might otherwise have intervened. But the most disturbing discovery lay hidden in the church's secret archives correspondence between Father Hauser and religious authorities in Rome, describing the Kellner family as subjects in God's great experiment and requesting guidance on the spiritual implications of concentrated bloodlines. The Vatican had been monitoring this genetic catastrophe for decades, treating it not as an abomination to be stopped, but as a test case to be studied. Letters dated back to 1821 revealed that church officials viewed extreme inbreeding as a method for creating purified souls closer to divine perfection. How many other communities across Catholic Europe were conducting similar experiments under religious protection? What network of correspondence connected isolated valleys where genetic concentration was being pushed to its absolute limits? The answers would lead Dr. Zimmermann far beyond Austria, into a world of calculated breeding programs that spanned multiple countries and involved the highest levels of government. But first, he needed to understand how the Kellner family had managed to survive when genetic science suggested they should have been extinct generations ago. The monastery bells of St. Georgian rang through morning mist as Dr. Zimmermann approached the fortress-like walls that concealed Europe's most genetically extreme human specimens. The ancient stones smelled of incense, damp earth, and something medicinal that suggested this religious sanctuary served purposes far beyond spiritual devotion. Behind these walls lived the survivors of genetic experiments so extreme they had been hidden from the world for over 50 years. Brother Augustine unlocked the heavy oak doors at 6:30 on May 2nd, 1847, his keys jangling against robes that concealed a body bearing unmistakable signs of inbreeding. His skull showed the elongated shape characteristic of extreme genetic concentration, while his pale blue eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. "We care for God's special children here," Augustine explained as he led Dr. Zimmermann through corridors lined with cells. "Those whom the world would call monsters, we recognize as miracles." The monastery's hidden records revealed its true purpose, housing the surviving products of noble breeding experiments deemed too extreme for public exposure. These weren't abandoned children, they were the successful results of genetic concentration programs. Individuals whose bloodlines had achieved purity levels previously thought impossible. In cell after cell, Dr. Zimmermann encountered humans who challenged every assumption about genetic limitations. A young man whose great-grandparents had all been siblings possessed mathematical abilities that bordered on supernatural. He could perform complex calculations instantly, without paper or instruments. His genetic concentration measured 87%. Another resident, a woman whose family tree contained only 6 distinct ancestors across 5 generations, demonstrated memory capabilities that seemed beyond human capacity. She could recite entire manuscripts after hearing them once, recall conversations from decades past with perfect accuracy, and speak 14 languages despite never leaving the monastery grounds. May 3rd, 1847, examined 12 residents. All show genetic concentration above 70%. Physical deformities severe but consistent. Mental capabilities exceed normal human ranges in specific areas. Beginning to understand the true purpose of these experiments. These weren't failed breeding attempts, they were successful ones. The Habsburg genetic program hadn't been trying to create physically perfect humans. They had been engineering enhanced mental capabilities through extreme genetic concentration, accepting severe physical deformities as an acceptable trade-off for supernatural cognitive abilities. Brother Augustine revealed the monastery's correspondence with royal courts across Europe. For 3 generations, they had been documenting the specific mental enhancements that emerged at different levels of genetic concentration. Memory, calculation, pattern recognition, and what they termed divine insight all showed dramatic improvement as bloodline purity increased. The hidden truth emerged. The breeding programs weren't driven by vanity or religious delusion. They were systematic attempts to create a cognitively superior class of humans. The severe physical deformities were considered acceptable casualties in pursuit of mental evolution that would justify noble rule through actual genetic superiority. Dr. Zimmermann interviewed Sister Magdalena, a nun whose own family tree revealed strategic inbreeding across 4 generations. Her physical appearance was startling, a severely compressed facial structure and limbs of unequal length, but her intellect was extraordinary. She could predict weather patterns weeks in advance, diagnose illnesses with uncanny accuracy, and seemed to possess intuitive knowledge about people's thoughts and motivations. "The blood calls to the blood," she explained in a voice distorted by physical deformities. "When the bloodline becomes pure enough, the barriers between mind and spirit dissolve. We see what others cannot see." The monastery's secret archives contain detailed measurements and test results spanning 50 years. Genetic concentration levels were carefully tracked against specific cognitive abilities. The data revealed consistent patterns. Memory enhancement peaked at 60% concentration, mathematical abilities maximized around 75%, and what they termed prophetic insight emerged only above 85%. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. The monastery served not just as a repository for successful experiments, but as a breeding facility for the next generation. The residents were encouraged to reproduce among themselves, pushing genetic concentration even higher, while their enhanced mental capabilities were carefully documented and reported to royal patrons. The Kellner baby's 92% concentration hadn't been an accident. It had been the culmination of a breeding program designed to test the absolute limits of human genetic concentration. His brief life provided data points for refining techniques that would be applied to noble bloodlines. What cognitive abilities might emerge at concentration levels approaching 100%? How many monasteries across Europe were conducting similar experiments? And what were the royal courts planning to do with their enhanced offspring once the breeding programs reached completion? The answers would force Dr. Zimmermann to confront a conspiracy that reached the Vatican itself, and a plan to create a genetically isolated ruling class with capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. The Apostolic Archives' marble corridors echoed with Dr. Zimmermann's footsteps as he descended into chambers that housed the Catholic Church's most forbidden genetic research. Dust motes danced in shafts of candlelight, while the musty air carried whispers of experiments that challenged the very definition of human nature. These secret vaults contained evidence that the Church had been orchestrating genetic concentration programs across Europe for over 2 centuries. Cardinal Alessandro Albani received Dr. Zimmermann in a private chamber beneath St. Peter's Basilica at 11:15 on May 28, 1847. The room smelled of aged parchment, beeswax, and something else, the metallic scent of preserved blood samples that suggested medical research far beyond theological study. Albani's own appearance bore subtle signs of noble inbreeding: translucent skin that revealed blue veins, and eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge accumulated across generations. "The Church has always guided humanity's spiritual evolution," Albani stated, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Sometimes that guidance requires unconventional methods." The Vatican's secret archives revealed the true scope of genetic experimentation across Catholic Europe. What outsiders dismissed as isolated cases of noble inbreeding were actually coordinated breeding programs designed to concentrate specific genetic traits deemed spiritually significant. The Church had been providing theological justification and practical support for these experiments since the 16th century. Document after document revealed systematic coordination between religious authorities and noble houses. Marriage dispensations that seemed to approve forbidden unions were actually carefully calculated decisions based on genetic assessments. The Church had been maintaining detailed bloodline records, tracking genetic concentration across multiple generations, while identifying families suitable for extreme breeding experiments. May 29th, 1847. Cardinal Albani confirmed Church doctrine supporting angelic bloodlines, belief that extreme genetic concentration produces humans closer to divine perfection. Vatican has been funding and coordinating breeding programs across 12 European countries. The theological foundation for these experiments lay in medieval interpretations of biblical genealogies. Church scholars had identified specific genetic markers they believed were present in biblical figures, arguing that concentrating these traits through strategic inbreeding could produce humans with divine capabilities approaching those of angels. Cardinal Albani showed Dr. Zimmermann preserved specimens dating back 3 centuries, blood samples, tissue fragments, and detailed anatomical drawings of individuals who had achieved extreme genetic concentration. The Vatican had been conducting primitive genetic analysis centuries before secular science developed similar capabilities. The Divine Bloodline Project accelerates. The Church's genetic research extended far beyond simple documentation. Vatican physicians had developed sophisticated breeding protocols designed to maximize genetic concentration while maintaining offspring viability. They understood which genetic combinations produced enhanced mental capabilities and which resulted in early death or sterility. Most disturbing was the discovery of selection protocols, detailed instructions for identifying children whose genetic concentration warranted special handling. Babies displaying specific deformity patterns were quietly removed from their families and placed in church-operated facilities for intensive study and breeding program preparation. Dr. Zimmermann examined correspondence between Cardinal Albani and monastery leaders across Europe, revealing a network of facilities housing hundreds of genetically concentrated individuals. Each location specialized in different aspects of the breeding program. Some focused on maximizing mathematical abilities. Others pursued enhanced memory or prophetic capabilities. The Kellner family had been selected for extreme experimentation, precisely because their isolation made them ideal test subjects. Church records revealed that Vatican physicians had been secretly monitoring their bloodline for 4 generations, providing medical support to ensure successful pregnancies while documenting the effects of progressive genetic concentration. But the Church's ultimate goal transcended academic curiosity. Cardinal Albani revealed plans for the Great Convergence, a coordinated breeding program designed to produce a generation of individuals with genetic concentration approaching 100%. These beings would possess cognitive abilities so far beyond normal human capacity that they could legitimately claim divine authority. The plan involved bringing together the most successfully concentrated bloodlines from across Europe, creating unions that would produce offspring, representing the mathematical limit of human genetic concentration. These children would be raised in Vatican-controlled facilities, trained to serve as intermediaries between humanity and divine will. Dr. Zimmermann discovered breeding schedules extending into the next century, with specific noble houses assigned reproduction targets designed to optimize genetic concentration. The Habsburg, Bourbon, and other royal dynasties had all committed to participating in this final phase of human genetic evolution. The Kellner baby's brief existence had provided crucial data for these calculations. His 92% concentration proved that such extreme genetic purity was achievable, while his specific deformity patterns offered insights for managing the health complications that would inevitably accompany the final breeding phases. What abilities would emerge in humans achieving 95 or even 98% genetic concentration? How many children had already been born with such extreme bloodline purity? And what was the Church planning to do once it achieved its goal of creating genetically divine humans? The investigation was about to reveal the breeding program's most successful products and the supernatural capabilities they had already begun to demonstrate. The underground chambers beneath Vienna's Hofburg Palace hummed with an otherworldly energy. As Dr. Zimmermann encountered the breeding program's most successful products, the air itself seemed charged with intelligence, carrying whispers in languages that predated recorded history, while shadows moved with unnatural precision around figures whose very existence challenged human understanding. These were the children whose genetic concentration had transcended every biological limitation, and whose capabilities suggested something beyond human evolution. Dr. Elizabeth von Krantz unlocked the reinforced doors at midnight on June 15, 1847, her keys activating mechanisms that sealed chambers designed to contain beings whose abilities required constant supervision. The corridor smelled of ozone, medicinal herbs, and something indefinable, an electric quality that made hair stand on end and skin tingle with anticipation. "Prepare yourself," von Krantz warned as she led Dr. Zimmermann deeper into the facility. "What you're about to witness will challenge everything you believe about human potential." The Habsburg dynasty's most secret facility housed 12 individuals whose genetic concentration exceeded 90%, the mathematical pinnacle of 4 centuries of strategic breeding. These weren't patients or prisoners. They were the successful culmination of genetic experimentation that had transformed isolated humans into something approaching a new species. In the first chamber, Dr. Zimmermann encountered Anna Maria Habsburg, age 16, whose genetic concentration measured 94%. Her physical appearance was startling: severe facial compression, translucent skin that revealed internal organs, and limbs that had developed in impossible configurations. Yet her eyes held intelligence so profound it seemed to penetrate directly into observers' thoughts. Without speaking, Anna Maria began solving mathematical equations that Dr. Zimmermann had been working on for months. She completed calculations in her head that required teams of university mathematicians weeks to finish. More unnervingly, she seemed to anticipate his questions before he asked them, responding to thoughts he hadn't yet verbalized. June 16th, 1847. Subject displays cognitive abilities that exceed theoretical human limitations. Mathematical processing speed, unmeasurable by current methods. Demonstrates apparent telepathic awareness of observer thoughts and intentions. The facility's records revealed systematic documentation of supernatural capabilities emerging at different concentration levels. At 90% concentration, subjects displayed perfect memory retention and accelerated learning. At 92%, mathematical and linguistic abilities transcended normal human ranges. At 94% and above, subjects began demonstrating what researchers classified as divine insight. Dr. von Krantz introduced Dr. Zimmermann to Franz Joseph Habsburg, age 14, whose concentration measured 96%, the highest level ever recorded in a living human. His physical deformities were so severe that he required constant medical support. Yet his mental capabilities approached the supernatural. Evolution reaches its breaking point. Franz Joseph could predict future events with uncanny accuracy, describing political developments and natural disasters weeks before they occurred. He spoke fluent Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and several languages that scholars couldn't identify, tongues that seemed to emerge spontaneously from genetic memory rather than learned education. Most disturbing was his apparent ability to influence others' thoughts and decisions. Dr. Frame. Zimmermann found himself agreeing to requests he hadn't consciously considered, making choices that seemed to originate from Franz Joseph's will rather than his own. The young man's genetic concentration had produced capabilities that bordered on supernatural mind control. The facility's hidden archives contained correspondence with similar institutions across Europe, revealing a network of ultra-concentrated individuals being prepared for coordinated deployment. Each location housed subjects with specific enhanced capabilities. Some specialized in mathematical prediction, others in linguistic interpretation, and the most advanced in what researchers termed divine communication. Dr. von Krantz revealed the program's ultimate timeline. Within 5 years, the church and participating royal houses plan to deploy these enhanced individuals as religious and political leaders, using their supernatural capabilities to justify claims of divine authority. Their extreme genetic concentration would serve as proof of spiritual evolution that transcended normal human limitations. The breeding program's success had exceeded all expectations. What began as attempts to concentrate noble bloodlines had produced beings whose capabilities suggested they represented a new stage of human evolution, or perhaps something beyond human entirely. Dr. Zimmermann examined medical records, documenting the specific genetic combinations that produced different supernatural abilities. The research suggested that approaching 100% concentration would yield capabilities indistinguishable from those attributed to biblical prophets and saints. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. The facility housed pregnant women whose unborn children were projected to achieve concentration levels of 98 and 99%. These babies would represent the mathematical limit of genetic concentration beings, whose capabilities might transcend every boundary between human and divine. What would happen when humans achieved complete genetic concentration? How would beings with such supernatural capabilities interact with normal human populations? And what were the church and royal houses planning once their breeding programs produced individuals whose genetic purity approached absolute perfection? The answers would force Dr. Zimmermann to confront a conspiracy designed to fundamentally alter the nature of human society and his own role in either exposing or enabling humanity's genetic transformation. The birth chamber trembled with unnatural energy as contractions began at 3:17 in the morning on September 12, 1847. Candles flickered without wind, while the air itself seemed to thicken around the laboring woman whose child would achieve the mathematical impossibility of 99% genetic concentration. This birth would either represent the pinnacle of human evolution or herald the emergence of something that was no longer human at all. The Château de Malmaison's hidden medical wing reeked of carbolic acid, frankincense, and ozone that crackled like approaching lightning. Dr. W. Zimmermann stood among church physicians and Habsburg court doctors as they prepared to deliver what their calculations suggested would be the most genetically concentrated human ever born. A child whose bloodline purity approached absolute mathematical perfection. Duchess Marguerite von Habsburg-Bourbon writhed on the surgical table, her own genetic concentration of 89% having prepared her body for this ultimate pregnancy. Her husband and brother, Crown Prince Maximilian, paced the chamber while monitoring devices tracked fetal development that exceeded every biological parameter. 4 generations of precise breeding had culminated in this moment. Every marriage, every pregnancy, every death had been calculated to produce genetic concentration that pushed the absolute limits of human survival. The child developing in Marguerite's womb represented the convergence of bloodlines so pure that normal genetic science suggested life should be impossible. September 12th, 1847. Fetal genetic concentration confirmed at 98.7%. Unprecedented achievement in human breeding. Physical deformities will be severe, but projected cognitive capabilities approach theoretical divine levels. As labor progressed, observers noted phenomena that challenged rational explanation. The room's temperature fluctuated wildly without apparent cause. Metal instruments became magnetized. Several witnesses reported hearing voices speaking in unknown languages, while others experienced spontaneous religious visions. Dr. von Krantz monitored the delivery with instruments designed specifically for ultra-concentrated births. The child's brain activity registered at levels that exceeded measurement capabilities, while neural development patterns suggested cognitive architecture fundamentally different from normal human consciousness. At 4:43 a.m., the child emerged. The baby's physical form was so severely compromised that survival seemed impossible, yet vital signs remained stable despite deformities that should have been fatal. His skull had developed in an elongated pattern that accommodated brain tissue 3 times normal volume. His limbs showed the extreme shortening characteristic of advanced genetic concentration, while his skin possessed the translucent quality that allowed observation of internal organ function. But his eyes held intelligence that seemed ancient, beyond his minutes of life. When Dr. Zimmermann approached with examination instruments, the newborn's gaze tracked his movements with awareness that suggested full conscious recognition rather than infant reflexes. Most unnervingly, the child appeared to communicate through direct mental contact rather than vocal cries. Observers reported receiving complex thoughts and images that seemed to originate from the baby's consciousness, mathematical concepts, historical knowledge, and prophetic visions that no newborn could possibly possess. The perfect bloodline speaks. Church representatives immediately began documenting the child's supernatural manifestations. Within hours, the baby demonstrated mathematical processing capabilities that exceeded adult genius levels. When presented with complex equations, his eye movements traced solutions with perfect accuracy, despite lacking the physical development necessary for speech or writing. Cardinal Albani arrived from Rome, carrying authorization documents that revealed the Church's ultimate intentions. The child would be raised in Vatican-controlled facilities designed specifically for beings of his genetic concentration. His education would focus on developing the supernatural capabilities that his bloodline purity had unlocked, preparing him for eventual deployment as living proof of divine evolution. The breeding program's success had exceeded every expectation. 4 centuries of genetic experimentation had produced a being whose capabilities suggested he represented something beyond human, a bridge between mortal and divine consciousness that could legitimize religious and political authority. Through actual supernatural demonstration, Dr. Zimmermann realized he was witnessing the birth of what church authorities genuinely believed was the next stage of human evolution. The child's extreme genetic concentration had produced cognitive abilities that transcended normal limitations, suggesting that continued breeding programs might ultimately create beings indistinguishable from the angels and prophets described in religious texts. But questions remained about the long-term implications of such genetic extremes. How would beings of this concentration interact with normal human populations? What happened when genetic purity approached 100%? And what were the church and royal houses planning to do with their enhanced offspring as they matured and developed their supernatural capabilities? The investigation was about to reveal the conspiracy's ultimate scope, and Dr. Zimmermann's own impossible choice between exposing humanity's genetic transformation and becoming complicit in its acceleration. Dr. Zimmermann's pen trembled over blank paper as he sat in his Vienna study at dawn on October 1, 1847, knowing that his next words would either expose humanity's most dangerous secret or condemn him to lifelong complicity in genetic manipulation that transcended every moral boundary. His decision would determine whether the world learned about breeding programs designed to create a genetically superior ruling class, or whether that transformation would proceed in absolute secrecy. The morning light filtering through his window illuminated documents that could topple governments and shatter religious institutions across Europe. His investigation had uncovered irrefutable evidence of coordinated genetic experimentation spanning 4 centuries, involving the highest levels of church and state in systematic human breeding that pushed biological limits beyond recognition. Cardinal Albani's final offer echoed in his mind. "Join us, Doctor. Help guide humanity's evolution instead of opposing it. Your medical expertise could accelerate the program by decades. Imagine the divine beings we could create with your assistance." The Habsburg court had made similar proposals, offering wealth, title, and position in exchange for his silence and cooperation. They needed his documented evidence destroyed and his medical knowledge applied to refining breeding techniques that would produce even more genetically concentrated offspring. Dr. Zimmermann understood the implications of both choices with crystalline clarity. Exposing the conspiracy would trigger investigations that could destroy the delicate political balance maintaining European stability. Kings and queens whose authority rested on claims of divine bloodline would face questions about the genetic manipulation underlying their legitimacy. But remaining silent meant enabling the creation of beings whose supernatural capabilities could fundamentally alter human society. The Church's breeding program was approaching completion, with plans to deploy genetically enhanced individuals as religious and political leaders whose cognitive abilities would make resistance impossible. October 1st, 1847. Final decision. must be made. Evidence could expose conspiracy, but would destabilize entire European political structure. Silence enables continuation of genetic experiments that may represent humanity's evolutionary future or its enslavement. He thought of the Kellner family's genetic tragedy, the monastery residents whose enhanced abilities came at the cost of severe physical suffering, and the newborn whose 99% concentration had produced capabilities that challenged the definition of human consciousness. Were these experiments representing divine evolution or systematic abuse? Did genetic concentration actually unlock supernatural abilities, or were observers interpreting enhanced cognitive function through religious frameworks that justified continued manipulation? The evidence remained ambiguous enough to support either interpretation, yet too compelling to dismiss entirely. The choice crystallized brutally. Dr. Zimmermann walked to his fireplace and fed each document to the flames, watching 4 months of investigation dissolve into ash and smoke. His journal entries, the church correspondence, the Habsburg medical records, the monastery documentation, every piece of evidence that could expose the breeding conspiracy burned away into historical obscurity. But he retained detailed mental notes and began drafting a different kind of document, medical protocols for managing genetic concentration that exceeded normal human limits. His silence had been purchased not with gold or titles, but with the opportunity to guide genetic experimentation toward humanitarian rather than exploitative purposes. If the breeding programs would continue regardless of his choice, perhaps his involvement could reduce suffering while ensuring that enhanced humans served humanity's interests rather than replacing normal populations entirely. The conspiracy would proceed, but under medical supervision, designed to prevent the worst excesses of genetic manipulation while documenting the true extent of capabilities that emerged at extreme concentration levels. Dr. Zimmermann spent his remaining years traveling between secret facilities across Europe, treating genetically concentrated individuals while carefully documenting their abilities and limitations. His medical innovations extended their lifespans and reduced their physical suffering, while his research helped refine breeding techniques that minimized deformities without sacrificing cognitive enhancement. He died in 1863, taking his secrets to the grave while leaving behind medical advances that would influence genetic research for generations. His choice to collaborate rather than expose had shaped the development of enhanced humans whose bloodlines continue to influence European society in ways that remain carefully hidden. The breeding programs never fully stopped. They simply evolved with advancing medical knowledge and shifting political circumstances. Even today, genealogical researchers occasionally discover noble bloodlines whose genetic concentration suggests continuation of strategic breeding programs that began centuries ago, while unexplained cognitive abilities in certain family lines hint at genetic manipulation that transcends conventional inheritance patterns. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.